So what do you do when your kids say, "You're raising me in a bubble"? Today on Life Talks, we're going to be talking about how to lead and protect your children, preparing your children for life, but also how do you handle the issues of the world and what do you say to them? How do you lead them through this process? And today on Life Talks, this is what we're going to be talking about. Dan?
Yes, and this is not something that just your kids will say to you. This is something that parents say to each other. Well, you can't raise your kids in a vacuum. You can't raise your kids in a bubble.
And the reason why we're bringing this up is we've had people come to us and say, I raised my kids in a Christian environment. I sent them to a Christian school or I homeschooled them. And then they left my house and they went into college, university, and they're adults now. They're coming back to me and saying, almost very antagonistically saying, you raised me in a bubble and you didn't expose me to all these things and to the real world. And I think there's a reality that people are experiencing this, but is that true? I think there is kind of a flawed thinking that we somehow have to expose our children to the crevices of the darkness out there. But this is a real issue. I think a lot of parents right now, probably my age, your age, a little bit older, are just really wrestling with maybe second guessing. I thought I was protecting. I thought I was shielding my kids from things, and now it's coming back to bite me. Yeah. What do you say to parents that are in that situation?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would want to say is, first of all, your 22-year-old is not in a position yet to give you parenting advice. I mean, and I don't mean that to sound as cold and so forth.
Cut right to it, Dan.
Yeah. But seriously, sometimes we over-respond to the criticism of others without. We almost automatically assume that everything they say is valid or true or so forth, and there is no perfect method of parenting. There are no perfect parents, and no two kids behave the same way to the strategies you use in your homes. Understanding all of that, you can only go by the truisms, the principles, hopefully of the Word of God, but even of life in general. And so don't just automatically assume, well, he said I kept him in a bubble. I guess I was a failure, or I shouldn't do that with my other kids. No. Let's back up and ask yourself some questions on what was your motivation for doing this? What were you trying to do? Because you don't know what would have occurred had you done the opposite.
I think that's a really good point, because even for myself and Liz, we talk about things that, we're at the tail end of having children in our home. And I think that all of us, and you probably do it too, there's things that maybe you and Julie talk about. You wonder, I wonder what would have happened if we would have done this differently.
Oh, just about every day, every moment. Yeah.
But there is that part of you that questions,
but
am I doing it right?
No 22-year-old kid comes to you and says, man, you parents, you should have sheltered me more. I mean, of course they're going to say that. But
go ahead.
Let's go back to just the motivation behind this. And let's use a common illustration of why I believe that it is a right thing to shelter your children. And I like to garden. That everybody knows that's one of the few hobbies I have is to garden. And sometimes I like to start my own plants. My goal is to harvest good fruit. That's what I want to do. I want vegetables and fruits for my dinner table. To get there, the process begins when they're seeds. And as we're taping this right now, it is January. In about 5 or 6 weeks, I will get egg cartons, and I will put a little soil in them, and I will put a seed in each one of the pockets. I will make sure the soil is appropriately moist, and then I will place it in my windowsill, and I will wait for anywhere from 3 to 9 days for the seed to sprout. At that time, it becomes very critical that I pay attention to what's going on, because if I get them too wet, they'll die of rot. Right. If they get too dry, in just a matter of hours, they'll wilt.
The root system is so fragile.
At this point, and that process takes about another 3 weeks to get them to the next stage. At about 5 or 6 weeks of from the seed, I need to start preparing them to transplant them. Hopefully by that time, the frost will be largely gone and so forth. So what I do then is I will take them outside and set them on my back deck. First day for 30 minutes. And then the next day, I'll take them out for an hour, and then I'll take them out for 2 hours, and then I'll leave them out for, the evening, late afternoon, evening, and I gradually work out to where I can leave them out all the time. If I take them out the first day and leave them outside, they'll sunburn.
Mm-hmm.
People don't understand plants will sunburn, but
Yeah.
absolutely,
Yeah.
even my succulent cacti collection will sunburn if I leave it out. They have to readjust to the bright light and to the heat and to all the other elements.
Yeah.
I have to watch out for bugs because a bug will
Yeah.
kill a little
Yep.
plant very
Absolutely.
quickly.
Yep.
I have to watch out for fungus. There's all these other things I'm watching out for. Then finally there comes a time when I transplant them, but even when I transplant them, I put a cage around them to protect them initially. I make sure there's no the fence has no holes in it because the rabbits will come in.
Right. Right.
They have to have more water. I have to fertilize them.
Yeah.
So even it's not until they really take off, start blossoming and so forth, that I can kind of like rest a little bit.
And then you revisit it every couple days, make sure everything's good.
Make sure everything's good, and I still stay in contact with
Yeah.
them. So this is the same thing. This is the same thing with children.
Yeah.
It is ludicrous to think that we can just take our kids and just expose them to the elements of a world that is harsh and hard and dangerous, and that, well, at least one or two will turn out okay. Well, you may be okay with those success ratios, but I'm not.
Yeah.
And so at the same time, you don't take them and leave them indoors and try to produce fruit while they're still indoors. It won't happen. They won't germinate.
Yep.
They have to be cross-pollinating. There's all different kinds of things. It doesn't work. You got to take them outside eventually. And you don't do it suddenly. You do it in a process. That's the same way with parenting.
Yeah.
One of the things I was just reading about this yesterday that disturbs me is the amount of exposure our young children are getting to things that are not healthy. And I was watching, big controversy, because cable news loves outrage. But this was outrageous that there were 4 or 5-year-olds being taken by their parents to see drag shows.
Yeah.
Which
I've heard.
For what reason?
It's sickening and it's despicable, and it's I think about what Jesus said when he talked about people leading children into sin. It's like you might as well put a millstone around your neck. The whole idea is
absolutely
God hates it when you corrupt children.
Yeah.
And we're seeing the corruption of children at an earlier and earlier age all the time.
And it's intentional. That's I think.
Exactly.
So a child's character, sociologists will tell you, is largely formed before the age of 7 years of age.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you're establishing baselines for normalcy,
Yep.
and that's why it's good to teach your kids, other than fantasy toys, give them a mop and a broom, give them a shovel and a hoe, give them a hammer and a saw, give them things that are like work, because that's part of how they learn.
Yeah.
And also they'll develop a good attitude toward
That's right.
it. That's why you should let them follow you around outside when you're changing the oil in your car or painting something. And if they're going to get in the way, it's going to mess up. But this is an important part of their training. You're setting standards of normalcy, that work is something grown-ups do, that you are responsible for your own messes.
But what you just said normalcy. And I think that's the issue, is that today what has been normal for decades, centuries, millennia has now been flipped upside down. So now what the radical leftist, socialist leftists want to create is a normal that is not biblical at all. And I think that's what when kids are coming back from their university saying, "You raised me in a sheltered environment." Well, no, maybe what we did is, as a Christian, we raised you in a Christian home with Christian standards
and in a safe environment.
And so it's not necessarily, again, I like what you said, don't necessarily believe what they're saying. At the same time, I do agree with you. There is this, every time we talk about parenting, I feel like I use the same two words, and I've shared this illustration multiple times when we've had these conversations. But the whole idea is your role as a parent is to protect and prepare. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, so there's the protection is really high when they're young, and it wanes. You're starting to expose them to more things. But preparation increases as they get older. So it's like decreasing protection, increasing preparation. And so you see that how they eventually, as they get older, year by year. But here's the thing, Dan, that's more of an art than science.
Yes.
And I think that's what's really difficult is some, when you have multiple children, some of them can handle things at earlier ages than other kids. If you just make this blanket statement, well, when you turn 13, you can do X. Well, that might not be a good idea for don't have age standards for things, have maturity standards for
Yeah.
things. And so,
And I think you also have to understand, not only are there differences in the rate of maturation, there are differences fundamentally between boys and girls. And
yeah,
again, our culture in
yeah,
this egalitarian mindset that we try to adopt, but there are some things, there are some responses that boys have that girls don't have, and there are
mhm,
some attitudes that, and you have to be aware of those.
mm,
And it's not bad. It's God given. It is not abnormal. It is part of the way God's designed. Don't buy into the world's mindset and philosophy.
mm,
And I think that's something that we tend to do. Just because they call themselves an expert, just because they have a few extra letters
yeah,
behind their name,
yeah,
does not mean that they know what's best for your life, your family,
that's
your
right.
children.
Yeah,
And get a little dose of self-confidence in what you're doing, because nobody knows more, and the government educators, and
yeah.
they don't know more about your kids than you
Yeah,
do.
and I think you need to let your kids know that if you're having this conversation with an adult child, one of the things I would tell them is, what has transpired over the last 10 years of what is normal, of what we sheltered you. No, no. This is what a normal parent has done for
Millennia.
millennia. So do not tell me that, all of a sudden the standards are all out of whack. I
Right.
think it's give them a perspective to see things from your point of view. And again, that's hard to do because until they have their own kids, they're gonna have issues. And I also want to say this. There is still a reality. I don't want to dismiss this. There is the reality that Christian parents can shelter their kids too much.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Well, yeah, and I think again that's tantamount to the idea that you never take your kids outside of the
I mean, I think the point is
greenhouse. Yeah.
that we don't want to put blanket statements on anything. What we do want to say is that there's a lot of wisdom involved in parents saying, you know what, my kid's not ready for X, or they're not ready to hear about this or be exposed to this.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that because you had standards or your parents had boundaries growing up that is necessarily, they kept you in a bubble.
Right.
Um,
Oh, and say that again for the people sitting in the back, because that is really, really important. Just because you have standards does not equate to overprotecting them or keeping them in a
yeah,
bubble.
I mean that's a normal parent is saying, you know what, you may not be ready for
Yeah.
this.
So let's look at this philosophically real quickly, and then I have another thing I want to come back to. But philosophically, we need to understand that there is a system that's satanic in its origin that says there is no such thing as absolute truth, and authority is bad, and you can't trust authority. So what is happening now is everybody's truth is equally valid. If you don't want to be a man but you were born male, then you can be a woman, and that's true for you, and that's okay. If you don't want to live within the confines of a marriage commitment, marriage vows, then it's okay to be polyamorous. It's okay to be open, to have open marriages. I'm seeing this everywhere in the media today. Let's talk about open marriages and open sexuality and so forth, and this is very, very prevalent among our younger generations, where it's and so forth. Now, this is the normalization of deviance.
Yeah.
And deviancy is identified whenever there's an absolute standard. And when there's no absolute standard, i.e. the Judeo-Christian values that we get from Scripture, then if there is no standard, there is no standard maker.
That's right.
And if there's no standard maker, there's no God.
Yeah.
And you see, and it's a subtle but effective way of separating us from God. God designed us. Design is everywhere you look. And within that design, it's not only among the physical, but it's also among the philosophical as well. So God has given us standards by which we should live, determine right from wrong. Not everything is okay. Not everything is equal. So this is a battle for worldview at its fundamental state. One of the things that really frustrates me also, speaking of worldview and so forth, is the idea of how we rear our kids spiritually. And so there's this school of thought. It's very popular. And it's basically, I'll let my child choose when they're old enough what to do about religion, believing that we can raise them in a spiritually neutral state. There is no such thing as a spiritually neutral state.
That's right.
You're either on your way to heaven or on your way to hell. You're either dying or you have eternal life. And as a child, when we separate themselves from the reality of our human condition and our spiritual condition, we set them up dangerously. So here's the thought is that I'm not going to force my kids to go to church. I'm not going to force any religion on them. By the way, taking your kids to church or Sunday school is not forcing any more than having them go to school.
Yeah,
You're
right.
parenting, you're
Yeah.
leading, you're educating,
Yeah.
but you're not. This isn't about force because no one can be forced to believe.
That's right.
But you are exposing them.
That's
And
right.
you're educating them.
Yeah.
And the ludicrousness of saying, well, I'm never going to force my kids to go to church. I'm going to let them choose for themselves. None of us choose the right thing naturally. You know, we're going to choose what we want, what feels good,
Yeah.
what's convenient. So many other reasons to choose otherwise. So you don't say, well, I'm not going to force you to go to school. I'm not going to force you to brush your teeth. I'm not going to force you to eat your vegetables. I'm not going to force you to learn to read. Well, then why would we say I'm not going to force you? No, but what you do is you educate them, you teach them, you set standards, you
That's
give
right.
guidelines, you have expectations.
That's right.
I have the expectation, you and I did as well in our home, even when our kids were older. The expectation is if you live under my roof, you're going to go to church.
Yeah.
Even my kids were adults, but still living at home or whatever,
Yeah.
they didn't have to come to my church.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the
Yeah.
biggest things that you have to realize as parents. If your kid turns 16, like, hey, I want to try this church over there, let them try the church.
Yeah.
Like, if they don't vibe with the church you're going to, hey, just let them go to a church that they like it, and I think that's a good thing that if they want to find their own church to go to, praise God for that.
Yeah.
You know?
And I would make it narrow. I'm not going to let them go to church
Exactly.
teaches
Yes.
apostasy.
Yeah.
None of my kids desired that, by the way.
Mhm.
They wanted something similar. They wanted something where they didn't get known by their last name, quite frankly.
Yes.
And you and I both have that problem because
Yes.
we're pastors.
Yes.
But here's what the standard was. The standard was when Sunday morning at 9:00 comes up, you don't get to sleep in on Sundays. Not if you want to live under my roof, eat my
Mhm.
food, and put your feet under my tables. So the bottom line was it wasn't unreasonable.
Mm-hmm.
It was this is our policy. If you don't want to go to church, that's fine. Rent an apartment. but that sounds really cold, but it's basically this is my stand. No one should be surprised. This is our standard. So but I did not have that policy for my 6-year-old or even my 16-year-old because incrementally we had to relinquish control to them as they matured and were capable of making those decisions with some autonomy.
Yeah.
And that's part of the art, you
Yes.
said,
Yeah.
of parenting, because not every child reaches that capacity at the same time, which
Yeah.
is why I'm saying today many of our kids are well served by doing a gap year between high school and college where they have absolute freedom.
Yeah.
And when they're living under your house, when they have fewer freedoms, there's that gap year programs that many places are providing that helps with the transition. So and that wasn't available when you and I were kids or much. So
Yeah.
these are things wise parents explore and use as part of the journey.
Okay, so I want you to answer one question. I'm going to answer the question first, and then you can answer it, and then we're done because we only got a few minutes left. But if you could give advice for parents to say, okay, my kids are young, I want to do the right thing of having boundaries and expectations and standards, but I also don't want to overprotect. What should I do? Okay, my one is, I think there's a lot of things you can do, but my one bit of advice would be this. As your kids get older, explain the why behind the what, because I think they need that. I think a lot of times when you have these standards of, hey, you're not allowed to go to have sleepovers. When they're young, they're like, oh, well, but eventually you tell them this is why, And I think you have to get in the routine of explaining the why. Now, eventually, they might not have the same convictions as you, right? But you need to the older they get, I think a good and a wise parent will explain the why behind the reasoning of their convictions. And that way they know this. You may not agree with this. When you're your own parent, you can make up your own mind, but there is a reason for this. It's not like, well, it's just because I said so. That you can do that up until a certain age, but as your kids get older, explain, even if they don't question it, even if they're if they're like, okay, Dad, that's fine, explain to them This is why, and point to this is why it flows out of a sense of love and out of a sense of responsibility of leading your family. That would be my biggest advice to parents who are wanting to do this correctly.
So I've got number 2 and number 3 that build
Okay.
on that because
Okay.
I agree 100% with what you said. So number 2 is this: give them the freedom to disagree with you.
That's good.
Disagreement does not necessarily mean rebellion.
Yeah,
Rebellion
yeah.
takes place when you act on the disagreement.
Yes. Yeah.
But your kids, and you can be reasonable. You can say, you know what? I hear you and I understand you. I don't see it the same way, but maybe I ought to write this down and remember it, because when you become a parent, that may be something you want to do as a parent that's different than
right.
me. The third thing is be willing to negotiate as they mature. Because
I love that.
I think there
That's
are
really
some
good.
times, I remember one of my kids was upset because they had like a 10 o'clock curfew. And so we talked about it, and I said, well, what do you want? And they said, well, I think I should be able to stay out till midnight. And I said, well, I just think that's too generous. But here's what I'm willing to do. I'll tell you what, let's compromise. I'm going to move a little bit. You're going to move a little bit more than me, but we're going to go to 10:30. And if at 10:30 you show up at the right time, and if you do that for 6 months, then we'll move it to 11, and then we'll be halfway between the two of us. Now, they still wanted midnight, but they were sure happier with 10:30 and 11 o'clock than they were with 10. And it allowed me to be reasonable and allowed them to rise to the challenge of maturity.
Yes. And the other thing you can do is use that as leverage to say, okay, I'll give you 11 o'clock or whatever if you do these 3 things that you should, you're slacking on.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's part of the teachableness. Like, hey, I will give you more freedoms as you show more maturity. And so here's the way you show me more maturity. I think that's some phenomenal advice, Dan. I hope if every parent hears that, I hope that you will learn, because Dan and I, we were bullheaded parents that just said, that's the way it's got to be.
Yeah. One of these days, just for fun, we should invite all of our kids, all 7 of our kids in here.
Goodness.
And they can tell you what lousy parents we were.
I'd be so scared about that. I'm just teasing. We'd have fun though. We would laugh a lot if we had all of our kids and our wives in here. That would be great. Thank you again. I know this has been a brief episode, but it's a good and important episode. Just because you have standards doesn't mean that you are raising your kids in a bubble. And make sure that you are just reminding your little ones about that. That's important. So thanks again for joining us today on Life Talks. We're going to be part 2 of this next episode, just to let you know, we're going to be dealing with a real life situation. Dan, we got an email at our lifetalks at lifecharlotte.com email address about a parent who has a real life situation of how they walk their children through some heavy things that are going on in their family. So we'll deal with a very practical illustration of this in our next episode. Thanks again for joining us on Life Talks. We'll talk to you next time.